The magic number Americans say they need to retire comfortably in 2026 is $1.46 million. The median amount a middle-class household not yet retired actually has saved right now is $67,000. And here's the part your retirement calculator is too polite to say out loud. At 43, you are statistically past the halfway point of your wealth building window, but you still have enough time to end up in completely different territory depending on what you do in the next 5 to 7 years. Not 10, not 20, 5 to 7. That's the window. And it is already open. I spent the last decade running a business surrounded by fiscal lawyers and accountants who showed me how money actually moves, not how it's marketed to move. Multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money are in the market right now, so I'm not theorizing. And the pattern I keep seeing is this. People at 43 think they are in the middle of the game. They are not. They are in the final act of the setup. Everything after 50 is largely playing with the hand you've already been dealt. This video is about understanding what's in your hand right now and the specific moves that still change the outcome. Here's what I'm going to walk you through. There are 4 forces operating simultaneously at 43 that will determine whether you're comfortable at 65 or miserable at 72. I'm going to show you each one. I'm going to show you the math, and I'm going to show you a case study of 2 people who started from the same place and ended up in completely different retirements, not because of luck and not because of income, because of decisions. But before any of that, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a statistic about what happens to stable, long-term employed workers between age 50 and retirement. That changes everything about how you should be thinking about your timeline. Most financial content does not go near this number because it dismantles the most comforting assumption people make about when they will retire. But first, the thing that makes 43 different from 42 or 44. I call it the launch window problem. And it's the central metaphor of this whole video. So let me set it up right. A spacecraft launching toward a specific orbital target has a narrow window, sometimes just minutes, where the angles and velocities and gravitational geometry align. Miss it, and you spend the rest of the mission correcting, burning reserve fuel, arriving late, or missing the target entirely. The physics doesn't hate you. The physics just doesn't negotiate. Compound interest works the same way. It doesn't grow linearly. It grows exponentially, which means missing the window by 10 years doesn't cost you 10 years of growth. It costs you the exponential output of those 10 years compounding for everything that follows. At 43, you are inside the retirement launch window. The trajectory is still settable. The math still works dramatically in your favor. But the window is narrowing, not with each passing year, but with each passing decision. And the window doesn't close when you're broke. It closes the moment you realize the math has shifted past your ability to correct it. That's when it gets quiet and expensive. This is the launch window. It comes back. There are 4 things happening at 43 that I want to break down. And the order they're in matters because they compound on each other in ways most people miss. Let's start with the one that is simultaneously the most important and the most ignored. You think the problem at 43 is not saving enough. That's a real problem. But the actual deeper problem, the one underneath that one, is that most people at 43 are building a retirement plan based on an assumption that the data has already disproven. The assumption is this, that they will work until they plan to retire. They won't. Half of them won't. And that's not speculation. That's from a joint analysis by ProPublica and the Urban Institute using data from the Health and Retirement Study, a long-running panel study funded by the Social Security Administration and the National Institutes of Health. They found that more than half of workers who entered their 50s with stable, long-term jobs, people who had been with the same employer for at least 5 years, solid performance reviews, no obvious warning signs. More than 56% of them were pushed out of those jobs involuntarily before reaching their planned retirement age. Not because they wanted to leave, because of a layoff, or because pay and working conditions deteriorated to the point where staying was no longer viable, or because a corporate acquisition made their role redundant. 56%. And here's the part that makes it worse. This doesn't discriminate the way people expect it to. 58% of long-term workers with only a high school education face damaging involuntary job losses after 50. Among people with college or graduate degrees, 55%. 3 percentage points lower. Education does not protect you from this. Your industry, your seniority, your performance record, none of it provides the protection most people assume it does. Age discrimination charges filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reached 16,223 in 2024, up from 11,500 in 2022. The trend is moving in the wrong direction. The financial consequences of a premature job separation are severe and often permanent. The typical older household loses 42% of its income when one member leaves a job prematurely. And even among those who find new positions, which takes longer and is harder, the older you are, very few recover to their previous income level. So when you're at 43 and you think, I've got another 22 years of contributions ahead of me, the realistic planning number is probably closer to 10 to 15 before something disrupts the plan. Not because you're pessimistic, because the data is, why does this matter specifically at 43 and not at 50? Because 43 is the last age at which you have enough runway to build a financial buffer capable of absorbing an involuntary exit at 53 or 55 without it being catastrophic to your long-term plan. By 48, the buffer math gets dramatically harder. By 52, most of the leverage is gone. I call it the launch window. You're still inside it. But the key insight is not save more. It's save with a different target in mind. The target is not a retirement date you control. The target is a financial position that survives the retirement date being chosen for you. Stay with me, because this next part changes everything. This is where the actual arithmetic of 43 becomes both clarifying and sobering. Here is the single most important mathematical truth about your current age. 10 years of contributions between 43 and 53 are not worth the same as 10 years of contributions between 53 and 63. Not even close. The first decade is worth roughly double the second in some scenarios, more. And I mean that in precise compounding terms, not inspirational poster terms. Let me be specific. Take $50,000, invest it today at 43, at 7% annual return. That's in the neighborhood of the long-term real return on a diversified equity portfolio. 22 years from now, at 65, that $50,000 has grown to approximately $221,000. That's what the compound growth formula produces. 50,000 times 1.07 to the 22nd power. Now wait 10 years. Same $50,000 invested at 53. Same 7% by 65. You've had 12 years, not 22. The same 50,000 grows to approximately 113,000. The cost of that 10-year delay on a single lump sum, about $108,000. You paid more than double your original investment in opportunity cost for waiting a decade. Apply that to monthly contributions. $500 per month starting today at 43, compounding at 7% annually. For 22 years, you end up with somewhere in the range of $311,000. The same $500 per month starting at 53, 12 years, same return. Roughly $113,000. The difference is nearly $200,000, generated by $500 a month. And that 12-year second window assumes you still have income. Given what we just discussed about involuntary job separations, that 12-year runway after 53 could easily compress to 6 or 3 or 0. 3 levers operate inside the launch window that don't work the same way outside it. Lever 1, maximizing the base. In 2026, the 401k employee contribution limit is $24,500. If you're not hitting that number, you're leaving tax advantage compounding on the table. Compounding that is worth dramatically more at 43 than it will be at 52 because it has more years to run. Your employer match is free money. And any contribution you make below the match threshold is one of the only guaranteed returns that exists in investing. The structure of the 401k was designed to help people accelerate contributions late at 50. The catch-up contribution kicks in and you can put in an additional $8,000 per year for a total of $32,000 500 in 2026. But the catch-up only matters if you built a meaningful base before it arrived. Lever 2, tax structure positioning. At 43, you're likely in a higher income bracket than you'll be in early retirement. That makes traditional pre-tax contributions strategically valuable. Now you defer tax at today's higher rate and potentially pay it at a lower rate in retirement. But Roth conversions, done strategically in your mid-40s while your balance is still manageable, set up years of tax-free compounding that you'll thank yourself for at 63. This is a decade-level tax decision that most people punt on indefinitely because it's not urgent, it's just important. Lever 3, reducing the drag. And this one is the one that produces the most visceral reaction when people actually look at the numbers. By the way, hit subscribe if you're finding this useful, otherwise the algorithm may never surface this content to you again. There's a type of financial damage that doesn't appear on any line item of your investment statement. It's not labeled fee or cost. It just shows up as a smaller ending number 30 years from now. And it comes from something the industry has quietly normalized: the expense ratio of actively managed funds. Here's the number. $100,000 invested at 8% gross annual return over 30 years in a fund charging 0.05%, which is what a basic S&P 500 index fund typically charges, grows to approximately $992,000. Call it $1 million. The same $100,000, the same 30 years, the same gross market return. In a fund charging 1%, which is not an unusual expense ratio for an actively managed mutual fund, it's actually on the low side of active management, grows to $761,000. The difference is $231,000 from 1 percentage point on $100,000. Not a rounding error. That's a car, a college education, a decade of retirement income. Scale it up to a $500,000 portfolio. Analysis published by LPL Financial shows that a $500,000 portfolio earning 7% gross over 30 years at a 0.5% annual fee grows to approximately $3.3 million. The same portfolio at a 1.5% fee grows to approximately $2.5 million. The gap, more than $815,000. A fee difference of 1% costs you $815,000 in compound growth. That number is more than most Americans have saved in total. And the maddening part is that most people don't know what they're paying. The expense ratio doesn't come out of your paycheck. It comes out of your fund's returns before the number ever hits your statement. You never write a check for it. You never get an invoice. It just erodes silently every year, compounding in reverse while your returns compound forward, except the fee wins because it never has a bad year. The S&P SPIVA data, which tracks whether active managers outperform their benchmark after fees, shows that over 15 or more years, active managers underperform the index roughly 85 to 90% of the time. So you're paying more for worse results on a compounding drag that multiplies over time. At 43, with 22 years of runway left to 65, that 1% fee has 22 years to quietly extract from your compounding base. This is the launch window metaphor again. A 1% fee is a 1-degree error in launch angle. At liftoff, it looks trivial. $231,000 later, you're off target in a way that can't be corrected in flight. Here's something relevant before I go to the next section. Here is the part that never makes it into a retirement calculator. The math is one thing, and actually building a system around the math is another. I've spent years reading the research on retirement failure patterns, and the gap is almost never about people not knowing the rules. It's about not having a framework that translates the rules into specific numbers and dates and decisions for their actual situation. I built a digital book called The Exit Code. It's 8 chapters built on 50 years of actual retirement data, compressed into a mathematical framework for exiting the workforce on your terms. 2 things in that book are directly relevant to what we've just talked about. The first is the 58% rule, the data behind involuntary workforce exits, and the specific buffer size you need to avoid the cascade failure we'll get to in a few minutes. The second is the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces the 4% rule with something that actually accounts for sequence of returns risk in the critical first decade of retirement, the decade that can make or break everything else. It costs less than a dinner out through the link in the description. And then let me show you why that sequence risk matters more than most people think. Now, the third force at 43. People think the risk to a retirement portfolio is the market going down. That's not the real risk. The real risk is the sequence of when the market goes down. Specifically, whether it goes down in the first 5 to 10 years after you start withdrawing from your portfolio. Here's why the sequence matters. Two retirees can have the exact same average annual return over 20 years, the exact same number. But if one of them experiences the bad years early while they're making withdrawals to cover living expenses, their portfolio depletes dramatically faster than the other person whose bad years came late. When you sell investments during a downturn to pay your bills, those shares are permanently gone. They cannot participate in the recovery. The portfolio base gets smaller precisely when you need it to grow. Early losses combined with withdrawals shrink the portfolio at a pace that later gains cannot reverse. Charles Schwab research describes this as sequence of returns risk. The order and timing of poor investment returns can have a big impact on how long your retirement savings last. The risk, as researchers at Flip Flops and Pearls describe it, is greatest in what they call the retirement red zone, the 5 years before and the first 10 years after retirement. During that window, your portfolio is at or near its peak, and any losses have the longest time to compound against you. If you're 43 right now, your red zone starts at roughly 57 to 58. You have 15 years to build a portfolio and a withdrawal structure that doesn't catastrophically fail if the market drops 30% in year one of your retirement. Most people discover sequence of returns risk at 63. By then, the only moves left are defensive. This is where Marcus becomes relevant. Marcus is not someone I know personally, but the pattern he represents is one I've seen in variations across dozens of conversations. Marcus is 51 now. He had a solid career in corporate finance, same company for 11 years, thought he'd comfortably retire at 63. His plan was reasonable on paper, about $240,000 in his 401k. And his thinking was that 12 more years of contributions at his current rate would get him where he needed to be. At 51, his company was acquired. His role was described as redundant. The severance was 8 months. He assumed he'd be re-employed in 3 to 6 months. He wasn't. At 53, he found part-time consulting work at roughly 60% of his previous income. The 2-year gap cost him not just missed 401k contributions, roughly $48,000 in compounding, that simply doesn't exist now, but he'd also drawn down $12,000 from savings to cover health insurance premiums. Because he was 51 to 53, not 65, Medicare was 12 years away. The ACA marketplace gave him premiums of over $1,000 a month, and his income during the gap disqualified him from most subsidies. His neighbor David is also 51. Same industry, similar income history, but David had made specific decisions at 43. He had maxed his 401k contributions for 7 years before turning 50, switched all of his holdings to low-cost index funds in his late 30s, and built a 12-month cash buffer explicitly designed to absorb an involuntary job exit without touching his investment accounts. David got laid off at 52. Same economic disruption, same industry. He was out of work for 14 months. He didn't change his lifestyle in any meaningful way. His buffer covered the gap. He went back to work eventually, but from a position of choice, not desperation. His sequence of returns exposure was managed because his buffer meant he didn't have to sell assets during the downturn that coincided with his gap period. Marcus and David made similar money for most of their careers. The difference between their retirement trajectories was built during the launch window. The decisions made between 40 and 50, not the decisions at 51 when everything became urgent. I want to put specific numbers to this. Call him Kevin. Kevin is 43. He earns $120,000 a year. He has $85,000 in his 401k. His employer matches contributions up to 4%. He has no other significant investment portfolio. In Trajectory 1, Kevin does what most Americans do. He contributes just enough to get the match 4%. That's roughly $4,800 a year from Kevin, plus $4,800 in employer match, so about $9,600 per year going into his account. Starting from $85,000 at 7% annual return, 22 years later, Kevin ends up with approximately $760,000. That sounds like a lot. Until you account for 3% annual inflation eroding purchasing power over a 30-year retirement and the $172,500. Fidelity's 2025 research says the average retiree needs for healthcare expenses alone, his real usable retirement pool shrinks dramatically. At a 4% withdrawal rate, he's generating somewhere around $23,000 to $25,000 a year from his portfolio before Social Security, and that's assuming he reaches 65 with everything intact, which the 56% statistic suggests is not the base case. In Trajectory 2, Kevin maxes his 401k starting today, $24,500 a year. Starting from the same $85,000 base, maxing contributions for 22 years at 7%, Kevin ends up closer to $1.8 million. He's crossed the 1.46 million threshold that Americans currently identify as what they need to retire comfortably. In Trajectory 3, Kevin does everything in Trajectory 2, but he also audits and replaces his fund lineup. His 401k was defaulted into actively managed funds, averaging 1% in expense ratios. He switches to index equivalents at 0.07%. On a portfolio that grows toward $2 million over 22 years, the fee savings compound to somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 additional dollars at retirement. Trajectory 3 generates roughly $2 million plus. Trajectory 1 and Trajectory 3 start from the identical position. Same salary, same age, same current balance. They diverge based on decisions Kevin makes in the next 60 days. That's how asymmetric the launch window is. Now here's the fourth and final variable that most retirement projections leave out entirely, or if they include it, they model it incorrectly. Social Security timing is, mathematically, one of the most consequential financial decisions a person makes in their entire life. And whether you make that decision well or badly is almost entirely determined by decisions made in your 40s, not your 60s. Here is the math. For anyone born in 1960 or later, full retirement age is 67. Claim at 62, the earliest possible age, and your monthly benefit is permanently reduced by up to 30%. Wait until 70, the latest point at which delay increases your benefit and your monthly check is 24% higher than it would be at 67, because every year of delay past full retirement age adds 8% per year in delayed retirement credits. In dollar terms, someone with a projected monthly benefit of $2,000 at their full retirement age of 67 collects $1,400 a month at 62 and $2,480 a month at 70. That is a 77% difference in monthly income for life, including cost of living adjustments applied to the higher base. Over a 20-year retirement, the cumulative difference between claiming at 62 versus waiting to 70 is well over $200,000. For some people, it's the largest financial decision they'll ever make, dwarfing most investment decisions. But here's where the trap closes. Waiting to 70 only works if you have the assets to bridge the gap to cover your living expenses without touching Social Security between 65 and 70. Specifically, 5 years of lifestyle costs plus health insurance. And that healthcare bridge for someone who retires before Medicare eligibility at 65 is not a minor line item. Benchmark ACA marketplace premiums at age 62 run over $1,070 a month per person. At age 63, over $1,100 a month. At age 64, over $1,120 a month. That's before deductibles, co-pays, or any actual healthcare consumption. This is where everything converges. The person who gets involuntarily pushed out at 55, remember, 56% of stable workers, who doesn't have a buffer, who can't afford $12,000 a year in health insurance premiums while drawing down savings, who has no choice but to claim Social Security at 62 to survive. That person just permanently locked in 30% less monthly income for the rest of their life. Not because they made a bad Social Security decision, because they didn't have a buffer, because they didn't build one during the window. The cascade looks like this. No buffer at 43 leads to involuntary exit at 55, which leads to healthcare gap costs that drain savings faster than projected, which leads to Social Security at 62 instead of 70, which leads to a permanent 30% reduction in monthly income for life, which leads to retirement that doesn't look anything like the plan that was drafted on paper. This is a cascade failure. It starts at 43. The opposite is a cascade success. David, Marcus's neighbor, built one by making the right decisions during the launch window. He had 3 things when the disruption hit that the cascade failure person didn't. A buffer to absorb involuntary job loss without touching investment accounts. A fee structure low enough that his compounding wasn't being quietly drained, and enough flexibility to delay Social Security past 67. By the way, the median nursing home private room cost in 2024 was $127,750 per year, and Medicare doesn't cover it, but that's a whole separate video. The average financial advisor in America charges approximately 1% of assets under management, which means if you have $500,000 with them, you're paying $5,000 a year for a portfolio that, per the SPIVA data, underperforms a basic index fund the vast majority of the time over 15 or more years after fees. The conversation usually goes something like, we've constructed a diversified, actively managed allocation calibrated to your risk profile. Translation, we've selected a strategy with a fee high enough to cover my commission, and we're calling it sophisticated. I'm not saying all advisors are useless. Some are genuinely excellent, and tax planning and behavioral coaching have real value. But 1% compounding against you for 22 years on a growing portfolio is not advice. It's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care about your advisor's sales pitch. And there's the companion conversation that happens at the Medicare enrollment office when someone calls in at 62 trying to understand why their bridge plan isn't working. The answer from the other end of the phone is essentially, sir, this was supposed to be planned in your 40s, which is correct, and also deeply unhelpful. Marcus is 58 now. He's back in the workforce, not because he chose to be, but because the cascade played out exactly as the data predicted. He claimed Social Security at 63 not because he wanted to, but because the math ran out before he wanted it to. His monthly benefit is permanently lower than it would have been at 67 or 70. His retirement isn't a disaster, but it's not what he planned. He's working a job that's a tier below where he peaked because the launch window closed on him while he was planning to deal with it later. David retired at 62 from a position of choice, not because he was lucky, not because he earned dramatically more than Marcus, because he made the 3 moves during the window. Here's what those 3 moves actually look like in practical terms. First, audit the fee structure of every fund you're currently in, not someday, this week. Your 401k plan almost certainly offers both high-cost active funds and low-cost index alternatives. Most people click the default during enrollment and never revisit it. The default is rarely the lowest cost option. Switching from a 1% expense ratio fund to a 0.07 index equivalent on a $200,000 portfolio with 22 years of runway adds somewhere between $140,000 and $230,000 to your ending balance. That's not speculation. That's the compound interest formula applied to a fee differential. Run the numbers on what you're actually paying by checking the fund's expense ratio on any financial data site and compare it to the cheapest equivalent in your plan. Second, run the involuntary exit scenario. Assume your earned income from primary employment stops in 3 to 5 years, not 20. What does your portfolio look like in that scenario? How long can your current savings sustain your lifestyle without new contributions? What does the healthcare bridge cost you for 3 years before Medicare? If the answer to any of those questions is, I'm not sure, you have a planning gap that is not theoretical, it's probabilistic, and the probability, per the data, favors the bad outcome. Third, make the Social Security bridge decision now, not at 62. The decision to delay Social Security to 70 requires having assets to cover 5+ years of living expenses after you stop working. If you don't build those assets between 43 and 50, The decision gets made for you at 62 when the savings run out and the paperwork becomes the only option left. None of this is complicated. The math is accessible. The decisions are obvious once you can see them clearly. The only variable is when you see them and whether that happens during the window or after. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. And the quietly frustrating truth is that the people who ended up with the strongest retirements were rarely the ones making the most sophisticated trades or following the most complex strategies. They were the ones who figured out somewhere in their 40s that the game is about base rate decisions, time horizon, and fee minimization, not timing and selection and alpha generation. They set the launch angle during the window. They kept costs as close to zero as the market would allow. They built the buffer before they needed it, and they let 22 years of uninterrupted compounding do the rest. The window is open. At 53, it will not be open the way it is at 43. That's the